Hello, Mixmane here. Hope you're doing well since last time. I might stick with doing audio vlogs since setting up for VR is just tedious. Before I start on this topic, I do want to talk about why I did the previous two videos. Chances are you did not expect me to talk about the likes of mental health and fatphobia, especially the latter, and I don't blame you. But for me, I know for all my experiences over the past 20 plus years, what I've gone through, what I've had other people go through in other parts of the world, I didn't want to stay silent anymore. Talking about them means more to me than anything I can do that's music related actually. But I realise now there's one more concern that I need to talk about. Something that from scripting this video out multiple times is basically a sequel to the video how that hate leads into abuse. But remember, this is not something that just happens in that specific context. So with that said, let's talk about the belief that I think is best worded as, if someone is a bad person, they deserve to be treated badly, and how abusive individuals weaponize this to encourage abuse to the people around them. Just know I'll word it differently and put it on the screen for reference. At a glance you might agree with this belief. After all, bad people deserve bad karma and need to be punished for what they've done, right? And I don't blame you. The problem, however, is when abusive individuals try to drive the narrative to everyone around them to define what a bad person is, with the intention to justify their abuse towards their victims and even encourage that to the people around them, even when the victim hasn't done anything wrong. And when they do this, not only does the definition of bad person become warped completely, but also treated badly is translated to it's okay to abuse them. If you had watched the video on how fat hate leads into abuse, you would understand society basically does this on a larger scale, playing the role of the abuser and convincing us, the people, that it's okay to abuse bigger or fat people because we're seen as bad, not even human, done through multiple forms of what's essentially propaganda. And if you keep an open mind and pay attention to other things ongoing in the world right now, the tactics society had used in this context are the same they use when they talk about other forms of bigotry, be it relating to trans people, disabled people, Palestine, and so on. But past that, there's 5 things I do think it's important to discuss in relation to this belief and how the definition of bad person gets completely warped. Understanding bad actions, when abusers over-exaggerate bad actions, understanding that abuse is fake appearances, the question, what if someone genuinely does something bad or unforgivable, and then when minors get involved. To get on the same page, I think if you were to categorize all the types of bad actions in the world, there's 4 you can place them in. Mistakes, where regardless of most bad actions you do, you might have not known they were bad and you learn not to do them again. Minor bad actions, where in the grand scheme of things, they're not the end all be all if someone does them, so kinks, lifestyle choices, they would fit into this. Bad actions with nuance, as in there may be a valid reason as to why someone does something bad, like lying or piracy. And then unforgivable bad actions, like abuse in multiple forms, inciting genocide, being bigoted, and defending someone who has done such things. We also need to understand that just because some people have done bad things in the past does not mean they're a bad person in the present. We need to remember that people can change. It's why we should try to give more grace towards kids and teenagers, because remember, to any of the adults watching this, we were kids too, and we had to stumble a lot to get where we are in the present day. And even as adults, we still have to be open to learning and acknowledging that some of the things we have done were wrong. But obviously there's a difference between when someone has done something bad and then changes for the better, when they do something bad but for a valid reason, and when they continuously choose to be malicious, knowing what they're doing is wrong and refuses to change. For abusers, however, they don't care about any of that. For them, they just see someone doing something bad and decide they deserve to be abused, which goes into talking about when they over-exaggerate someone's bad actions. We need to understand that when abusers basically imply that all bad actions are quote-unquote equal, it basically has us divided and fighting amongst each other, especially when abusers are driving the narrative that you should treat bad people badly. Which becomes worse when you understand that things like being too sensitive or being woke, existing as black, gay, trans, fat, disabled, and so on are deemed bad in their book, when they're obviously not. But the reason why they do it at all is just to avoid having the attention focused on them for their own unforgivable abuse. Because the end goal for abusers is just to harm their victims and be above the consequences for it. And obviously, like a double standard, if we were to confront abusers for their bad behaviour, they'll do anything possible to avoid being accountable for it, even going as far as to try to frame us as bad people out of revenge for essentially exposing them. Because when abusers get called out for their behaviour, it's like they're at the gallows facing an execution, because it's like they built and thrived on having an ego that's dependent on bringing other people down, and without that ego, they're basically nothing. There's actually been a lot of experiences online and offline where I had to confront various abusers, and most of them have responded by labeling me as too sensitive to avoid being accountable for their abuse, Because yeah, I'm a sensitive person. That's not a bad thing. But that's the gotcha those abusers try to make when they say or do things that are abusive, especially when it involves bigotry. That's the narrative they have driven to label me as a bad person in their attempt to justify being abusive towards me. That's actually what happened in the workplace I spoke about in the Fat Hate video and a few times during my travels on the internet and VR chat. And there had been other times where abusers hadn't let down the fact I called them out and acted really unhinged and disturbing in their attempts to slander me. Whether they outright spread lies about me, over-exaggerating my past bad actions to label me as a bad person in the present day, even getting minors to do their dirty work and essentially encouraging them to be abusive. And that can be extremely muddy terrain to walk on, and I'll talk about that later when I talk about minors getting involved with the treat bad people badly belief. You'd probably think that abusers would be easy to catch out because their behaviours are obviously known to everyone around them. And well, yeah, there's probably a fair few who do that. We need to understand that there are other abusers out there who lie and deceive all of us who meet them that they're good people, acting performative or faking appearances. And this is where I believe a majority of us fall apart in the context of believing victims of abuse. You might be thinking, oh, but I would support a victim of abuse, mate. What are you talking about? Now I'll ask you this. What if the victim retaliates in some form towards their abuser? And to understand this, we need to talk about reactive abuse and understand ableism. If you're not familiar with reactive abuse, it's when an abuser intentionally provokes their victim over and over in an attempt to bait a negative reaction out of them. And when the victim does snap or retaliate, the abuser immediately pretends to play the victim and drives the narrative that the victim is unstable or is mentally ill and needs help in an attempt to paint the victim as a bad person. This type of abuse weaponizes a form of bigotry called ableism, which is the hate and oppression of disabled people. I'm not the best person to talk about it since there's a lot of layers to ableism, but for the context of this video, you need to understand there's a sub-layer of ableism called Saneism, which targets people with mental disabilities. And that's why abusers weaponize to label their victims as bad by using terms like unstable, mentally ill, too sensitive, even stupid, idiot, dumb, and retarded to imply there's something wrong with the victim. And this is also the same tactic some abusers have done when I spoke plenty about fatphobia in the early stages of speaking out online in their attempts to shut me down, because calling me immature was their way to invalidate whatever I was saying. We need to remember that abusers count on abusing their victims behind closed doors when no one can witness anything, and we can be fooled by how we see them in public that we believe that's their genuine personality behind closed doors too. We also need to remember there's always a power dynamic between an abuser and their victim, which is worse when abusers are the ones who are able to drive the narrative to everyone around them and gaining their trust. So it's not easy for victims of abuse to open up or confide in others, because for whoever the victim speaks to, they might respond in a way that implies disbelief. For example, but this person is so nice, I wouldn't expect them to be abusive. And this is where people who support victims of abuse fall apart when it comes to reactive abuse because of two things. The whole seeing is believing aspect, and then the expectation that the victim isn't going to retaliate or lash out in some form or capacity. And since the abusers are counting on the victim to do that, when the latter does, the same people who supposedly supported the victim will turn around and basically say, you did something bad, you're not the victim, you deserve to be abused. And it makes victims of abuse more isolated, feeling like they're not able to talk to anyone because they've been let down. And it takes a lot of fucking courage to speak up at all in the first place, while the abuser essentially gets away scot-free. It's a very fucking scary way victims can be gaslit into thinking they're the problem when everyone believes and pushes the message to them that the abuser is actually a good person. And it's for that reason victims might not be able to speak up in fear of getting abused or invalidated further. And at worst, a victim might actually believe the lies that they deserve to be abused, and that they are the problem, when it's a blatant lie. And this is amplified by bigotry when some people believe that by existing as X identity, and among others being trans, gay, big or fat, or disabled, that the victim's abuse is deserved, when it's not. With all that said so far, there's another crucial concern where a lot of people fall apart in relation to this belief we need to address. What if we're talking about someone genuinely bad or unforgivable? What if we're talking about an abusive individual? Is it okay to be abusive or bigoted then? And the answer is no. Do not misunderstand. I'm not saying we shouldn't hold them accountable for the bad they've done, or you're not allowed to feel however you do about the abusers in your life, but the moment you start believing that someone deserves to be abused because they are a bad person, you start believing anyone else who is bad is also deserving of abuse too. And when you understand this is how abusers already act towards their victims, as I talked about across this video, even towards other abusers, that becomes an extremely fucking dangerous mindset to have. Because it might start with a genuinely abusive individual, But then at its worst, you might start thinking anyone you don't like, even if they're not abusive, deserves to be abused as well. And this becomes more problematic once again with bigotry, because it manifests in two ways. Either by using someone's identity alone to label them as bad for the sake of abusing them, or when people believe it's justifiable to be bigoted when it's about a bad person. And that concern is why I don't like how some people are selective in their activism for this reason, because it comes off as performative. With fatphobia as an example, one of the concerns I remember hearing about a lot is when body positivity groups that claim to allow you to embrace your size and all that have weight limits. Or when people try to argue against fatphobia being bad because some people are bigger or fat because of genetics, implying that they'll only fight for the good fat people. Both cases, they imply that bad fat people are deserving of being fat shamed and don't deserve to be included in those groups, which is not okay. And on that note, we need to understand that all 6 forms of bigotry, as I understand it 6, intertwine one way or another. Because as mentioned in the last video, the more identities you come under associated with bigotry, the worse the harassment and abuse get. If you want everyone to be free from bigotry and the wrongs of the world, we have to include everyone, which will include people you don't like. By making exceptions to your advocacy to human rights, equality, equity, you're coming off performative. It's why I spoke about the concern in the last video with working communities claiming not to tolerate bigotry or abuse, but anything pertaining to bigger or fat people is dismissed or not taken seriously enough. And the thing with the specific workplace and community I spoke about there that didn't help either was the clear double standards set by the higher-ups. The workplace was a case where the outcome was, stop trying to call your colleagues out or they'll report you for harassment because we won't do anything about their fat jokes, even though that's clearly harassment. And the community was basically, I let fat shaming spread across the community because you shouldn't have one of the avatar you did. I mean, what the perps did wasn't okay either, but I was still allowed to do it. The pendulum has to swing both ways, because by making exceptions to the rules you enforce and set in place under the guise that someone deserves to be at the whim of bigotry or harassment, or you don't think it's a serious issue, you're being a fucking hypocrite. It becomes unnecessarily complicated with professional environments where laws are in place, but in community spaces, you have no excuse when someone brings it to your attention. It's in a similar vein where you cannot claim you're a good person if you're bigoted or abusive in any form or capacity. If you have to use your good deeds as a gotcha to justify to everyone around you that you're a good person, you're probably not. I was guilty of this too back in my teenage years, having the mashup channel stroke and ego I had to feel morally superior to my classmates. It's not something I'm proud of. And there's plenty others out there who believe that just because they're quote-unquote normal, that they're morally superior to anyone who's basically not thin, white, straight, cis, or able-bodied. Or those who believe going to church makes them a good person. And it becomes even more dangerous when abusers self-proclaim or imply that they're heroes or good people when they do abusive things under the guise that it's the right thing to do, like fat shaming out of health concerns, or when they deliberately weaponize rhetorics like trans people are pedophiles and disabled people are burdens to justify being abusive towards them. The last concern with the whole belief of treat bad people badly, which worries me the most, is when minors are both victims of this behaviour and then perpetrators of it. Because like I said earlier, there's a blatant difference between when they make mistakes and didn't realise what they were doing was wrong, and when they are taught abusive behaviours, intentionally and consciously choosing to act that way. And there's always going to be a tricky terrain to tread on, talking about it as an adult, but if we don't tread on it, how can we hope things get better? So let's start with minors as victims. Like I said earlier, we need to give kids and teenagers more compassion when they do bad things, but unfortunately there are abusive parents out there in the world who are unforgiving. And I believe it may tie into the fact that they don't view their own children as kids, and rather as slaves or objects they can control. And when those parents hold that belief, bad people deserve bad treatment, it sounds like a gotcha to justify being abusive towards their own kids, because they can twist the narrative to label their abuse as parenting. And until those kids realize that the way they were raised is wrong, they're going to believe all the things their parents taught them is like gospel truth, even when those things aren't morally right. And that's one reason why abusive kids and teenagers exist, essentially parroting the behaviours their parents, guardians, even society teaches them. And it becomes extremely problematic when they don't care that they're creating a generation of abusive teenagers going into adulthood, especially when the other reason why abusive kids and teenagers exist is because there's some abusive adults out there who directly teach and encourage them that it's okay to be abusive if someone's a bad person, which follows what I touched on earlier. The ones that scare me the most are those who are taught intentionally to justify their abuse by saying, I'm just a kid, just to avoid accountability for what they did, or that it automatically absolves them. And it doesn't. And it's always going to be the $1,000,000 question that if their parents or guardians aren't going to be the role models to stop them from being abusive or to hold them accountable for their behaviors, then who will? It's why I talked about in the last video how other minors who have to deal with their abusive peers need to resort to questionable means, if even their school won't do anything to stop the harassment. And if we don't want that happening, we need to start holding minors accountable for their behaviors before things spiral out of control. Because from the last video, I spoke about how someone in the early stages of me being online is now dead. And that's because of abusive teenagers they had to deal with in their school and their personal life, and the higher-ups didn't do anything to hold them accountable. And during my travels in VR chat, I heard there are other teenagers going through very similar things, being bullied constantly during their time at school, and when they try to speak up about it, they get invalidated or not taken seriously. And then when I'm on VR chat existing fat, how unhinged I've seen other teenagers act around me because they cannot fathom fat people existing on the platform, and existing means I must be deserving of abuse, on top of having the power of anonymity behind them to avoid bearing the consequences of their abusive behavior. And obviously VR chat is complicit in enabling this as well. Honestly, it's just terrifying witnessing this generation of teenagers and kids when I see them being outright malicious on the internet. And even if you try to justify that it's just online behavior, how do you think they'll act outside the internet, to their other peers, when they become adults? Because it's not impossible that they may become the adults I had to deal with in my workplace, who again were extremely toxic, who wanted to avoid accountability for being malicious. And it's at this point where I feel I should talk about myself, because for some people, certain abuses from over the years, they don't believe I would be in the place to talk about abuse under the assumption I still am an abusive individual. And honestly, I don't blame them for thinking that. So I owe that, given I've spoken a lot about abuses in this video. I was not a good kid or teenager in the past. I was fucking horrible. Yet, one of the core beliefs I held on to when I was little was that I wanted to be a quote-unquote good person, and who I idolized more than anybody in the world? Sonic the Hedgehog. But unfortunately, he wasn't the only influence around during those years. The bad influences who I won't mention basically corrupted my mind, where basically even when I felt like I was a good person, I was actually really horrible. That reflected predominantly during my high school years, where I had the inability to take no as an answer, which turned into the harassment of classmates, and overall being annoying and really toxic, yet not being accountable for those behaviors and playing victim consistently. Would you believe I used to be very bigoted in my past as well? My exposure to being online at the time, even under the Mixmaster name, paired with severe social anxiety, was not helpful either, and my depression was not an excuse for any of it. I wronged a lot of my fellow peers and online friends over those years. And even when the school caught on to what I'd been doing, and I was being held accountable for my behaviors, I was never in a place for a long time to actually learn my lesson, even when I should have. Fortunately, there were those moments where I had to realize what I was doing was wrong, that those bad influences weren't good for me, and I had to really challenge what being a good person meant, something I had to do continuously over the years leading into the present day on my own, with a few helping hands along the way. And I think honestly, having started to learn the dangers of fatphobia and anti-fatness in the world at the time was my biggest turning point in allowing me to change as a person, albeit from a questionable origin like my affiliation with feedism. But even when I was in a stage where my heart was in the right place, I still approached a lot of situations the wrong way. And honestly, I think anyone who I was friends with online through making music mashups would agree that I was fucked up in some form or capacity, and it took me years to realize that. Even through adulthood, I still made bad decisions, mistakes, and acted out badly to people around me, but I tried to catch myself so that I would learn for next time. But also, this was around the time I actually started to set boundaries for myself, like not tolerating bigotry or abusive behaviors, because looking back, I never really had them when I was a teenager. And unfortunately, this is where I called out so many people in my personal life and online as being abusive through fatphobia among everything else, and all I had to do was pay attention to their reaction, like what I spoke about in the last video. And a lot of the conflicts during my adulthood I dealt with where I did bad could be summed up as, yes, what I might have done was wrong, but the other person is worse. And it was because who I dealt with was an abuser in some form or capacity. Because even if I learned not to repeat my mistakes, those who are abusive at heart never will. But unfortunately, as mentioned in the mental health video, 2024 was the year shit hit the fan for me, because someone, not maliciously, did something that triggered a severe case of body and gender dysphoria, and since my brain processed it as trauma, it also affected the friendships and connections I made in VR chat that year, where I practically spent all my time for the year because it affected my ability to work, among other factors that went on at the time. And as mentioned in the last video, as someone who tried to live for myself for a very long time when I had nothing else to live for, that changed everything. And I was fucking fragile, both in the way of being highly sensitive more than I already was, but also that my mind wasn't thinking clearly, so I wronged some people pretty badly who helped me out a lot through that year. But looking back, not that it justifies any of the ways I wronged them, most of them were pretty horrible. So, after the past 20 plus years of living, where I've been in the position of being an abusive individual myself, surrounded by abusive individuals multiple times in my personal life, it's how I understand why abusers act the way they do, and how fucking painful it is to be a victim of that abuse. Making this video really made me self-reflect and realize how horrible I was to a number of people over the years. And honestly, if I could, I would reach out and apologize to them, and I promise I'm not just saying that. If I were to put a moral to the story of my life, it's that if you really want to try and be a good person in this world, you have to be willing to be open-minded, to continuously be able to keep learning. You have to be able to listen without judgment, because it might mean you have to challenge some of your own internalized bigotry, like I did. Or you might have to realize some of the things you were taught growing up since you were little weren't actually good things, which means in turn you have to be okay with being hated by essentially favoring human rights over being abusive. It's okay if you're not a perfect role model. Hell, I'm definitely not. But at the least, we can try to do the best we can. And that even if you are struggling wherever you are right now, what you're going through is valid, but it's not a justification for any bad you do towards other people. Because that was a big mistake I made when I was in high school. Because I know in another timeline, with all I said about my life story, I would be someone who would outright deny anything bad I did was wrong, who tries to downplay abuser's arguments, who gloats that my good deeds make me a good person, and believing and acting out on bad people deserve to be treated badly. The list goes on, and I was very close to crossing that line of no return. I'm still struggling now. We need to remember that we're not immune to propaganda, and that might take the form of whatever mum, dad, guardians, or school teaches you when they raise you, the media you watch, whether it's fictional or reality, because they're not without biases. The latter is why I spoke about fatphobia leading into abuse after all, because this mindset can, at worst, all start from when you're a kid. And I'm not gonna lie, it's tempting to out those abusers I've met, whether from my personal life or time on the internet. One of them who I knew I was gonna call them out did make a genuine point of saying, "May, you're in your 20s, grow the fuck up." And that was the case from last year when I was very in deep on VR chat, especially when it wasn't my battle to pick. But I'm not a very good listener, so I did one better. I made this video, I did one talking about fatphobia, exposing the tactics that any abuser would do. So hopefully you can try and pick up the red flags when you see them in your personal life, and avoid any connection you have with them. Because as mentioned earlier, I do worry for the bigger picture of, as harsh as it is to say, the threat that some abusers pose to other people. Because similar to what I said in the last video, it's one thing where I could brush off an abuser's threats or words, but for someone else it could really fuck them up. Badly. The reason why I tell you all this is because I do want to be transparent and honest when I talk about abusers, especially when, again, I'm aware there are some people out there who genuinely believe I'm not in a place to talk about abuse, since I was an abuser myself. It's also in the same way that I did admit when talking about fat hate leading to abuse, I mentioned dabbling in feedism, because technically it was something I was admittedly careless about opening up to on VR chat, though my relationship with it now is complicated. So yeah, I'm far from the best role model talking about both areas, but as I said earlier, if we're relying on perfect victims or role models to talk about any of the topics I had, mental health, fatphobia, treating bad people badly, no one's really going to be speaking out in the first place. And even though there's the risk of backlash speaking out about my experiences, I would still put my cards on the table if it meant someone out there can relate. Besides, you can't spell mixmate without mix. So that's that. We completed the trilogy of serious talks. Woohoo! So expect more fun stuff to come around. Past making covers, remixes, and mashups on this channel, I do want to do recordings of gameplays at some stage because I feel it could be fun. And then other things as well, like talk about favorite video game soundtracks, media of all time. Because I've come a long way from someone who was very close-minded when I was a teenager and never really kind of branched out to anything else. And obviously there's mashups to thank for that. Then obviously being on VR chat, that also opened a new world of possibilities too. So, woohoo! Anyway, take care in the meantime, wherever you are. Make sure you eat enough, hydrate, take any meds if you do, and until next time, bye for now.